Hey everybody, there's a skin museum in Japan, specifically tattooed skin. It's an exhibition of dead men's ink, preserved forever on skin turned to leather. It's not open to the public, which for me is a striking example of how different Japan is from America. Because over here, a skin museum and a Sonica would be the only economically viable businesses in some random town in Iowa, you know? In Japan, though, it's a curious footnote in the life of a medical professional treated now as seriously as it was when he was alive. Who was that medical professional, and why exactly did he collect human skin? Let's find out. Oh yeah, and obviously this video is going to be kind of gross compared to my usual subject matter. I won't be showing much of the nasty stuff, but if you don't want to hear about all this, go watch something else. Also, as usual, I'm not a historian. I'm an amateur writer who Googles things. Don't take what I say at face value. Check my sources out for yourself. And that goes double for today because, as it so happens, Fukushi Masaichi, allegedly also known as Dr. Tattoo, is pretty hard to research. The English internet treats him just like my hypothetical Iowan skin museum. Morbid fascination comes before citing sources or treating the subject with anything resembling respect. He actually isn't even the only person who's ever collected tattoos, just the one with the biggest collection. And also the most foreign guy to ever do it. A lot of the press surrounding him is deeply sensationalized in that kind of Orientalist way. Like a lot of English language material about Japan, it's built on the idea of Japan as a place where weird people live and wacky things happen, and rarely even attempts to probe any deeper than that. Unfortunately, this weird pop culture mischaracterization of Japan has resulted in a lot of damage being done to English-speaking people's mere ability to research any lesser-known topics like this, especially when they're niche or scandalous enough that basically only the lowest common denominators have written about them. You know, not that I'm a particularly high denominator myself, but you know what I mean. Now, I did try and check the Japanese internet for further details, but Google Translate still isn't up to spec. When I googled this dude's name in kanji, one of the first results was about his collection of more than 2 human skin tattoos. So I can't say I'm particularly swayed on the reliability of machine translation. Maybe someday I'll learn Japanese and make a better version of this video, but for today I'll unfortunately be relying exclusively on English sources. TLDR, take all of this with a grain of salt. The only definitively verifiable piece of information here seems to be that Masaichi did in fact collect tattooed human skin, and that what remains of his collection isn't publicly accessible. That's definitely verifiable. There are pictures of him handling tattooed flesh and mentions of it that predate the internet, including a Life magazine article from the 50s that features a Yakuza's bare tattooed ass opposite a Colgate ad. Which, Jesus. Plus a couple probably more credible mentions in, like, academic texts and books about tattoos. Anything beyond those essential details is potentially wrong. So potentially wrong that I almost didn't do this episode, but, like, no, you don't just learn about the Skin Museum and then hide that information in your soul for the rest of your life. I gotta try and tell this story. So, without any further ado, let's start things off with every detail of Fukushi Masaichi's life that I have no particular reason to doubt. He was born in 1878 and educated at the Tokyo Imperial University. He studied diseases and founded the Japanese Pathological Society, which still exists. And this website describes their 2025 meeting as their 114th annual get-together, meaning they were probably formed around 1911, which lines up with Masaichi's age. His early research was dedicated to syphilis, mostly on its links to aortitis and thyroid disease. But in researching the effects of syphilis, which include getting a bunch of big nasty ulcers on your skin, he made a lot of incidental contact with the world of dermatology. It didn't take long to go from a skin-deep occupational necessity to the focal point of his entire career. Since he worked in the Mitsui Memorial Hospital, a charity hospital whose patients were mostly lower class, he worked with many tattooed people. That led him to note that the spread of syphilitic ulcers was halted by the ink, something also noted in the Western world, specifically with red ink. In some circles, red tattoo ink was even used as a folk remedy for syphilis, which, I don't know, getting red tattoos all over my body doesn't seem that much better than having ulcers, especially when you know what was in the ink. Now, I don't know exactly what Japanese tattoo ink was traditionally made from. I did a little poking around, but I couldn't find anything I was comfortable stating definitively. What I do know is that the reason Western red ink halted the spread of syphilis is because it was made from cinnabar, which is mercury. The mercury poisoning hit the disease as hard as it hit anything else, so the end result was a painful retention of your regular old skin. Mercury poisoning, of course, isn't any reasonable medical professional's ideal cure for anything, so tattooing was very quickly relegated to the realm of quack medicine in the West, and presumably also by Masaichi. Regardless of how directly relevant it was to his syphilis studies, this brush with the art of tattooing would leave a permanent mark on our boy. He continued his regular work while also beginning to research the best ways of removing and preserving skin post-mortem. And in a way, Japan is a very fortunate country to be in if you're obsessed with tattoos, since the traditional ink in that country is the full-body irizumi. To be tattooed in Japan historically means committing at least your whole back to a work of art, probably more. So if you're looking to study tattoos, one body gives you a lot to work with. On the other hand, the kind of body that has tattoos on it in Japan usually doesn't belong to somebody you want to mess with. Tattooing in early Japan was nearly exclusively tied to criminals and outcasts because they were permanent, unignorable signs that a person was othered in some way. They were shameful signifiers of what you were and what you'd done, that made it all but impossible for a criminal to go straight. But as time progressed, those marks helped criminals and outcasts find their people. They created a sense of solidarity and community among the men they were supposed to other. Plus, they were a pretty useful intimidation method in a pinch. So, long after tattooing as a punishment fell out of fashion, tattooing remained an important element of the criminal underworld. Criminals, now organized under the banner of the Yakuza, turned them into an aggressive underground fashion statement, with their ink getting increasingly elaborate as time went on. That's a very basic summary, but it'll do for now. The long and the short of it is, Masaichi was deeply invested in an art most Japanese people saw as basically a crime in itself, an art you could only engage with through directly observing the bodies of some of the country's scariest men. To your average person, there was no artistic merit in tattoos. Masaichi's viewpoint was unique, and maybe that's what led him to go to the extremes he did. The thought that nobody else would ever think to study, celebrate, and preserve tattoos in the first place. There's unfortunately not much information on the English internet about his actual motivations, because we all just expect Japanese people to do weird shit, I guess. I've assumed a mix of medical curiosity and a sense of artistic preservation, but it could have been something else entirely. No matter why he did it, what Masaichi did for tattooing in Japan was monumental. He was a co-founder of the Tattoo League of Japan, a completely non-criminal organization dedicated to tattooing, which was revolutionary at the time. They seemed like a pretty chill group, just a bunch of marginalized people appreciating art together. Meetings occurred in bathhouses, where the heat and moisture turned the no doubt rough and world-worn skin of these outsiders into sleek, shiny canvases. I can't imagine how liberating it must have felt in those bathhouses, to finally be included in something that wasn't criminal. To be in a room of people who appreciated a part of your body that was guaranteed to cause you some kind of suffering almost anywhere else in the country. Masaichi did a great thing here. And not only did he facilitate the Tattoo League, he would pay for your ink if you promised to donate your skin to him when you died. Unfortunately, the best source on the Tattoo League is that aforementioned Life magazine article from the 50s. It's got a bunch of great pictures and some limited information, all presented from a painfully Western perspective that makes very few actual attempts to explain the cultural significance of any of this. This picture, for instance, is captioned, "Reptiles are popular theme among Tokyo tattoos. This specimen depicts a scene from ancient novel, and don't even get me started on the devil's mask next door." The whole piece has a sense of bewildered Orientalism about it that outdoes even the worst of the modern clickbait articles, and in fact I'm pretty certain most of those articles were just ripping this one. Which is a shame, because like I said, the pictures included are actually gorgeous and deeply informative in themselves, and some of the descriptions are fairly evocative in spite of coming from a pretty heinous place. A particular passage stands out to me. One very interesting design, unfortunately not yet in the doctor's collection, is that of a gambler who has playing cards all over his body and an ace appropriately concealed on the bottom of one foot. Another is that of a woman. A few women have been permitted to join the league, who has a polka dot towel tattooed over her left shoulder and a kitten tattooed on her lower right side. When the woman walks, the muscles of her shoulder and back move the kitten's paws in such a way that it appears to be playing with the fringes of the towel. Despite the writer's obvious enthusiasm for their tattoos, neither of these people are pictured in the article. That's a real shame. They're both more interesting to me than most of the people who actually got photographed. The apparently Western playing cards on the gambler and the ingenious motion on the woman both deserve to be appreciated. And yeah, it's pretty cool to hear that the Tattoo League were forward thinking about women as well as tattoos, especially in Japan where tatted women are a thorny subject, which I'll get back to later. For now, yeah, like I said, the Tattoo League was a great thing and probably Masaichi's most important contribution to Japanese culture. Though I doubt the modern youth movements towards acceptance of tattoos can be directly linked to a bunch of dudes getting naked together in the 50s, this was the first healthy organization most of these people had access to. For one of the first times in Japanese history, groups of tattooed adults could gather in a context completely devoid of criminality. That was big. And it was all seemingly a happy side effect of one man's medical curiosity. These people finally had a community, and our boy had a completely ethical source of tattooed flesh for his weird collection. At the height of his powers, his collection contained over 2,000 skins, all meticulously documented through thousands of photographs, and I can't help but wonder how many of them belonged to people he knew. How many of the people pictured in that Life article wound up at the end of Dr. Tattoo's scalpel? At least one person's family wouldn't let him skin their relative despite his having agreed to it. And while I am generally in Masaichi's court, I really can't blame anybody who wasn't down for that sort of procedure, because, you know, even if the end result is the permanent preservation of a piece of art so important to a person that they had it chiseled into their body, well, you know, the procedure for preserving skin isn't pretty. Yamato magazine claims he had both a wet and dry method, but I don't think anybody else has made that claim about him. Kimberly Chin's piece about modern-day American tattoo preservationist Kyle Sherwood mentions that he's developed both a wet and dry method, so I wonder if there was some confusion there. It seems like both Masaichi and Sherwood shared the same dry method though, and like I said, it ain't pretty. He peeled the skin off the body in one big piece. The Life article opens on a picture of a full-body tattoo captioned, "Fingers were cut lengthwise, making hands seem to have too many fingers." What followed was basically turning human flesh to leather. Oftentimes, he'd also frame the skin between two panes of glass for posterity. He did this thousands of times in his life, carefully preserving countless examples of an art form most people in Japan still have little respect for today. The results of his work are striking. Though the collection isn't available to the public, pictures are easy to come by. I don't know how much of that I want to risk showing on YouTube, but yeah, go look it up. It's really beautiful stuff, perhaps all the more beautiful for how morbid the medium of its preservation was. These skins retain the stories of the bodies and minds they once belonged to. Not only that, the collection as a whole is a monument to a man's dedication to a fringe culture and art form, and only 105 of them still exist. Between the bombing of Japan during World War II and a suitcase full of skin that was allegedly stolen in Chicago when Masaichi visited America, the collection was really whittled down over the years. I kind of don't believe the suitcase story, given how careful and meticulous he seems to have been, but it's too funny not to mention. Like, what the hell did the dude who stole that suitcase think when he opened it up? I mean, finding a suitcase of skin in Chicago seems like some deep mob shit. What do you do in that situation? Jokes aside, yeah, unfortunately most of the 105 remaining skins are contained in a private collection within a museum who takes it very seriously. It's not a place you can just book a visit to for fun. Some of them are on public display. A 75-page thesis I read by Yalamar Pagan contains a description of one that stuck with me. A full-bodied, tattooed skin stands on a wooden platform in a small branch of the University of Tokyo's Pathological Museum. It depicts the tale of Kintaro, the golden boy, and his fight against a giant carp from the neck to the upper thighs. The displayed skin is the result of a retired Yakuza boss's donation and is much smaller than one would imagine. Unfortunately, Dr. Sugimoto, the retired pathologist who curates and cares for the items in the museum, could not remember from what year the skin was. However, he did mention that it arrived at the museum in Showa 50, 1975. He also claimed that the reason for the skin's stature is because people did not grow that much taller back then, although when then is unknown. He stated that the skin's size most likely represents the male's accurate body size since not much shrinkage happens throughout the preservation process. But most of Masaichi's lifelong passion is now relegated to a private collection. It's treated with more respect than it would be otherwise, and I'm happy about that. I'm glad this man's work hasn't been relegated to the realm of some tacky attraction, which a museum probably would be. I just wish there were a compromise. It's a shame the way the world treats strange, unusual, and morbid things like this. In his life, Masaichi himself was that compromise. He created a venue through which outsiders and their art could be appreciated with as little othering and exploitation as was possible. As weird as he was, I want 1,000,000 of this dude. I swear to God, the world would be a better place if everyone was a little more like the Skin Museum guy. And that's about all I got on Fukushi Masaichi. Like I said, not really the deepest dive compared to like my Annie Oakley video, given how difficult it is to research a guy like this, but I'm happy with what I've come up with here. Dr. Tattoo turned from somebody I was modestly curious about to maybe my favorite person I've researched for this channel. I have a deep respect for anybody who's willing to do so much dirty, uncomfortable, widely maligned work for the sake of preserving art. Tattoos done right are works of art that represent the lives of the person wearing them more so than maybe any other form of art. Their images are words you were so passionate about you were willing to pay a fortune to get them carved into your body. A good tattoo is a piece of the wearer's soul, their personality, their life. Because of Masaichi, 105 people most of Japan would have happily forgotten have achieved a form of immortality. No matter how gross or shocking what he did was, I can't find it in me to say a bad word about him. Especially not in this era. AI is strangling basically every artistic medium on the planet, and particularly illustration. Tattoos are something uniquely human. While you could certainly pay somebody to tattoo an AI-generated piece on your body, a person's still gotta put the tattoo on you, and the canvas is inevitably human. Not to mention, tattoo culture, from what I've seen, is super heavily structured around the artists. Any decent artist will spend a good amount of time talking to you about what you want and will design the finished piece themselves. In my experience, artistic integrity and not ripping other artists off is a big feature of the culture. Even if I don't have any ink myself, in this climate, I find the art of tattooing increasingly respectable, important, and worthy of preservation. Like Masaichi, I basically stumbled into the world of tattooing by accident and came out of it absolutely smitten with what I'd seen. Going into this, I wasn't sure there was a video here. Coming out the other end, I'm happier than I've ever been that I decided to cover a topic. Okay, but I still have 7,000 words of notes I haven't used. Because I was genuinely passionate about this topic and because information was so scarce, I ended up going through every page of English language Google results and reading at least, I'd say, 10% of it in full. This included a 75-page college thesis. I didn't need to do most of this. This video could have ended at the end of Masaichi's story and nobody would have cared. But I did read it, by the end more because I was enjoying myself than because I was scared of missing some obscure scrap of information. And you know what? A lot of this stuff is worth talking about too. So the second half of this video is going to be a kind of all over the place recounting of all the interesting info I dug up that didn't have anything to do with the Skin Museum. Let's start by going back to Kyle Sherwood. Kimberly Chin's Tattoo for Life and Afterlife, currently hosted on the CUNY website, is mostly about him and his journey to becoming the first American to start a commercial tattoo preservation business. In fact, they claim to be the only business like that in the world. In a way, it's cool that tattoo preservation has gone from the completely unviable money pit hobby of one doctor to a niche big enough to sustain one whole company. Though Chin also mentions in this article that she saw the skin of a corpse presented like fine art at a tattoo expo in Vegas, which, assuming that wasn't the one Masaichi lost in Chicago, implies this is definitely an art other people have participated in other non-commercial contexts. And yeah, the existence of an expo like that kind of supports the tattoo museum joke I made up front. God bless America. Kimberly Chin's got a good little piece on Kyle Sherwood's odd niche little commercial continuation of Masaichi's work. Since Dr. Tattoo's process wasn't readily available and would have been at least half a century out of date by the time Sherwood got going, he had to start from square one. His first patient wasn't even dead. He was a, quote, bald, muscular, and tattooed businessman. This, no doubt, gorgeous-looking man just got a tattoo on some excess skin he was going to get removed anyway, and Kyle Sherwood got a little practice in. And then 34-year-old Eric Turney died, and his wife Candace got in touch with Kyle, hoping to preserve a tattoo he had of a heart with his son's name in it. At this point, Kyle was lacking in experience, to say the least. He'd never actually preserved a dead person's tattoo before, and told her he might fail. She agreed, knowing even a failure would mean her husband's body was going towards research that could benefit somebody else in her position. Kyle's interest in this subject had begun during a jokey conversation at a bar, and now here he was, at the early stages of his company, with a rich backer behind him and a dead man in front of him. he did it and says it's still the most memorable thing he's ever done. Obviously, the American single-piece tattoo isn't as impressive to preserve as a full-body Irizumi, but doing anything this strange and difficult hundreds of times is commendable. He's still doing this with methods he won't fully disclose in a move that'll remind real ones of the secrecy surrounding Lenin's body. God, I gotta remake that video sometime. Just like with Lenin, my biggest complaint here is that people who preserve human bodies are so secretive about it. Some of this information could benefit mankind, but no, it's all stuck in good old trade secrets or even state secret purgatory. Kyle Sherwood proved an interesting enough tangent in my research and a good break from some of the denser reading, but hey, that's where most of my time was spent. What started as me overestimating how much cultural context I'd actually need to comprehend Masaichi's story turned into me reading a ton of history I knew for a fact I didn't need to understand because I had become deeply fascinated in the subject matter. Tattooing in Japan is a rich and weird art form, and I want to share some of its history with y'all. The longest piece of writing I dipped into was the aforementioned 75-page thesis by Yelimar Pagan, which, I'll remind you, I only read because of its single offhanded comment about Masaichi. After confirming there was no new information about him, I started reading it out of curiosity. The subject sure caught my attention. It's mostly about tattooed Japanese women, a group I'd hardly ever heard mentioned in passing, let alone read a thesis about. She makes a good first impression, recounting a conversation with a friend who completely writes off her interest in studying Irizumi. To her friend, as to countless others, tattoos are nothing but a sign of criminality, of little more artistic interest than the laziest of graffiti tags. That view is fading, but remains prevalent enough that, infamously, most bathhouses refuse tattooed patrons outright. The Japanese cultural climate still favors people like Pagan's friend. I was hooked from the outset. This is a really interesting topic, and I got going reading the rest of the thesis as it discussed a general history of tattooing in Japan, plus a more specific section on the portrayal of tattooed women in media since Pagan was going for Master of Arts. I also supplemented the history section with a couple other articles on Japanese tattoos, notably a surprisingly informative piece from Collectors Weekly. What follows mostly originates from that and the thesis. So, as usual, take this with a grain of salt. I'm working on 2 sources here. I know I say stuff like that a lot, but my last video got nearly 400 views, and the sources page on my website got 10. I know you guys don't give a shit where your information comes from, and I'm trying to change that. Until that day comes, be warned what you're about to hear is a super base-level introduction to the history at hand, and some of it is probably wrong. Pagan's history of Japanese tattooing includes a few brief mentions of very early potential examples. Beyond Japan, among the earliest examples of Asian tattoos was the Ukak princess, a 2,500-year-old female mummy buried alongside 2 men. There are also the dogu, a kind of prehistoric sculpture created exclusively in the Jomon period of Japan. They bear markings similar to the tattoos of the later Ainu people, so these could represent the earliest depictions of tattoos in Japan. In any case, the Ainu people are descended from the early Jomon, and they're the earliest known group in the country to have definitively borne ink. Their traditions are completely separate from Irizumi, however, because the Ainu are basically entirely divorced from mainstream Japanese culture. To use a clumsy, imperfect analogy, they're sort of like the Native Americans of Japan, and some of the oppression they've faced stems from their history of tattooing. Early Japanese culture imported the Chinese belief in tattoos as a form of punishment, so of course the cultural stigma made the Ainu easy to scapegoat. In Ainu culture, women in particular were expected to be tattooed. The tattooist was an exclusively female role, with at least one elderly woman on hand in any given village who knew how to administer the culture's traditional marks. Tattoos were given using knife-like obsidian blades wrapped in fiber so the blade would reach the correct depth. Even with that safeguard in mind, this was a much bloodier process than many other methods of administering ink. The Japanese government would often cite this brutality as an excuse for the banning of traditional Ainu tattoos. They also saw the large facial tattoos as a form of child mutilation. See, the Ainu women got their first ink between 6 and 10 years old. It started as a small dot at the lip that turned to a grin-like curve surrounding the entire mouth as the girl grew into, quote, marriageable age. Arm and hand tattoos were also commonplace, believed to protect young girls from spirits and diseases. And that's all I'm going to say about Ainu tattoos. I haven't done enough reading to form a full opinion on this matter. I think digging an obsidian blade into a 6-year-old's face is pretty awful, but I also think governments suppressing indigenous cultures is real fucked up in a lot of ways, and it's obvious a lot of Ainu saw value in their tattoos and were negatively impacted by the laws banning them. The last fully tattooed Ainu died in 1998, and that's really unfortunate. No matter how strange or freaky its practices might seem, it hurts to see a whole culture fizzle out. The Ainu aren't widely discussed by basically anybody these days either. I wanted to use my limited knowledge to give them a bit more of a spotlight, but for most people, the history of tattoos in Japan basically starts with penal ink, if not irizumi later on. Pagan says the earliest examples of tattoos as a punishment was in 400 AD, when Hamako, chieftain of Izumi, was brought before the emperor in the first year of his reign. He was sentenced to tattooing instead of the death penalty. A tattoo was placed near his eye. The practice of face tats as a form of punishment is in the Joei Code of 1232, and there are a number of other written records, aside from the two she cited. We know that facial tattoos were a very common criminal practice in Japan throughout much of its history, and over the centuries, this punishment was sort of reclaimed by the criminals. If you had a face tattoo, you couldn't get a job, you couldn't be reformed, but you could easily find your people. So they started banding together and forming criminal organizations, which would eventually become the Yakuza. And that's how tattoos existed for a long time in Japan, as little face tattoos given as punishments. Japanese tattoo culture, as more than a criminal marker, really begins in the Edo period with the irizumi. The Edo period is the period between 1603 and 1868, and a lot happened in those 2 centuries. Edo society was structured around the shoguns, as you more than likely already knew. The military were up top, and below them were the farmers and other peasants who were taxed heavily and not allowed to buy land or sell the land they already had. The only thing they had going for them is that the artisans and day laborers were a step lower than them on the pyramid. And the only thing the day laborers had going for them is that the merchants were beneath them. Although the merchants made enough money that their low social standing was kind of offset. And below all of them were the outcasts, and they were divided into 2 groups. The Edo were unclean because their work brought them into contact with dead humans and animals. The Hinin were essentially criminals. They were beggars, hookers, scammers, entertainers, and religious pilgrims. These were the folks who would have been marked with tattoos. This is how society was divided in theory during the Edo period. But decades on decades of hardcore social stratification wears on people. Edo-era Japan had strict laws about goddamn everything, including clothes. Commoners were forbidden from wearing brightly colored fabrics or any kimonos with particularly elaborate designs. There weren't laws about brightly colored ink or elaborate tattoos, though, and people exploited that. Tattoos turned into a rebellious fashion statement. Pagan and Collector's Weekly both use the same source to contextualize this development, the Chinese novel Suikoden. By the late Edo period, it was already hundreds of years old, but relatively recently translated and still gaining popularity in Japan, particularly as late Edo censorship got worse. Censors weren't cool with fiction espousing anti-authority themes, but since Suikoden was written 300 years prior in another country, it wasn't considered directly relevant to modern society, despite its blatantly anti-authority messaging. The protagonists, a group of noble, honorable criminals who spent their lives fighting back against the government to defend the poor, struck a nerve for obvious reasons. The main band of heroes consisted of 108 people, including 36 main characters. They were known as the 108 Liangshan heroes because they shacked up in the Liangshan Mountains, and like I said, they were already pretty popular in Japan. But starting in 1805, their popularity would explode due to Kyokute Bakin, Katsushika Hokusai, and their 90-volume illustrated new edition of the Suikoden. The illustrations became massively popular imagery in the country, especially when popular artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi was hired to produce prints of all 108 heroes. This all sounds hilariously familiar to me as a lifelong comic book fan. The idea that Japanese people in 1805 were doing the same nerdy shit I'm doing now, but it was actually a super important political and cultural movement is amazing. Kuniyoshi's prints generally depicted their respective hero in the midst of an appropriately heroic action sequence. Here's Wang Ying perched over a ferocious river and Ding Desun doing battle with a massive snake. And here's Yang Zhang strangling his wife. Okay, some of these haven't aged so gracefully, but the artistic skill put into them is undeniable, and their influence even more so. Like, check out the guy on the left here, or Bai Shang on this one. Kuniyoshi, who had some history including tattooed characters in his illustrations, put Irizumi on some members of the 108 heroes who weren't described as having ink in the original text. The badass, brightly colored heroes already made for great tattoos on their own, and the fact that many of them had tattoos themselves only encouraged people further. These prints secured the place of the full-body Irizumi on the margins of Edo society, and because that rapidly became the defining Japanese tattoo, the equipment used to put ink on people is way different over there. The traditional Japanese tattoo needle is a sort of rake-like device, with multiple needles arranged together, because, well, how else are you going to put ink all over a dude's entire back before the advent of electricity? These needles are really effective at what they do. Their width means you can do a lot at once, and the way you distribute pressure over that width can create some really effective gradients. There are reasons beyond tradition that people still use them, basically. But they're also, well, kind of fucking scary looking, which probably didn't help the image of tattoos in Japan. Although there is another group beyond criminals, rebels, outsiders, and the 108 heroes you can pin the rise of tattoos on. The working class at large like to bear tattoos, but specifically firemen. The Edo period was a rough time to fight fires. Due to flammable building materials and the necessity of fire for cooking and light, Japan was really living up to the land of the rising sun name. Measures were taken, city streets were widened, and buildings were constructed further apart on the whole, but throughout the Edo period, firefighting remained a difficult job. Firemen employed a number of precautions to keep themselves safe. A lot of them wore heavy cotton coats, which sounds awful. But others, especially among the lower classes, developed full-body tattoos to provide spiritual protection from the fire. The tattoos depicted the kinds of powerful creatures still widely associated with Irizumi, like dragons and mythical warriors. Even the guys who wore those heavy coats often decorated those coats with similar images. Superstition was big among firefighters, and so was keeping up appearances. Tattoos were associated with tough, masculine men, criminals, rebels, and popular fictional characters. The process of getting a tattoo was painful. Weaker men would never see a full Irizumi through to completion. The firemen wanted to look tough. They wanted people to believe they were the kinds of strong, fearless men who could leap into danger and return unscathed. Though the firemen were the most commonly tattooed due to the danger and roughness associated with their job, this mindset was shared by other working men. For example, artisans, tradesmen, and laborers would get tattoos on their arms depicting a product or tool of their trade. And it's probably true that a number of these heavily inked laborers were also criminals on the side. Being an honest worker doesn't mean you're not also a criminal, of course, especially in a society where the ruling class is outwardly hostile to their workers. But honest workers still did wear Irizumi, and they especially stuck among firefighters. The tattoo was something to be proud of among certain Japanese men. Among women, less so. Sarah Thompson in the Collector's Weekly article says she isn't aware of any Edo period women getting tattooed outside of fiction. Pagan's paper, meanwhile, discusses tattoos among Japanese courtesans, as in prostitutes, which makes this my third video in a row where I mention prostitution in the 1800s. Each time on a different continent, too. Weird. If you watched my last one, you might recall why the oldest profession was rife in Victorian England, so what about Edo Japan? Well, like I said, the most successful members of the merchant class, no matter how technically low on the totem pole they were, had a ton of money on hand and exactly the kinds of skeevy desires you'd expect from well-off working men in a socially repressed society, especially since the merchants, like all lower classes, were forbidden from participating in politics or leaving the country. So during the Edo period, you saw the floating world come into existence. This was like the Edo version of a red light district. Legendarily scuzzy areas, home to every kind of morally questionable pleasure you might be after. Books at the time delighted in describing these pleasures to the people who didn't have the balls or capital to experience them firsthand. Until those censors I mentioned earlier got wind of those books and decided to ban them in the 1790s under the Kansei reforms, which is why Suikoden got popular, as publishers and writers shifted towards writing ostensibly apolitical historical adventure novels inspired by it. But the actual floating worlds themselves remained, and among their most popular residents were the courtesans. Courtesans, like basically every kind of sex worker throughout history, rode a fine line between keeping their regulars at a distance while making them feel special and some kind of loved. Since both sides of the relationship understand the courtesan isn't truly interested in the customer outside of his being a customer, some guys would ask their preferred gal for proof of love or at least loyalty. Alongside the usual understandable signs of affection like love letters, a Japanese courtesan may have also cut off some of her hair or all of her hair, or she could have gotten a tattoo. The courtesan and her customer would both both get a small mole-like dot between the pointer and thumb so that the moles touched when they held hands. Things like phrases and names were options too, but the subtlety of the mole made it popular as it avoided leaving any visible marks on the, quote, merchandise. So tattoos on men were symbols of individuality, pride, hard work, criminal affiliation, and/or general toughness. Meanwhile, tattoos on women marked them as essentially products owned by men. The history of tattoos in Edo, Japan offers a remarkably vivid cross-section of how the lower classes lived back then. I think that was the most interesting thing I discovered while researching this video, and I have to wonder how similar or different a look at other countries' histories of tattooing might be. Speaking of other countries, the arrival of Commodore Perry and subsequent rise in Western influence in the late Edo led the Japanese government to start feeling self-conscious. The early Meiji government pushed Japanese citizens away from things they feared Westerners would view as barbaric. Western-style clothes were in, and tattoos were now illegal. Another major casualty was the samurai topknot, but since tattoos are more easily concealed than hair, the tattoo industry simply moved underground. That cemented the criminal connotations of ink, of course, with the Yakuza rallying around tattoos. Though laborers would continue to wear irizumi through the Meiji era, guys who wanted to look respectable started seeking other means of self-expression. Also worth noting, tattoo shops were still legal. Tattoo artists would still continue to operate above board around the ports, because giving tattoos to foreigners was still legal. And somehow the Japanese government never stopped to think that if foreigners are getting tattoos, that maybe they don't find them as barbaric as had been feared, or that, those legal tattoo shops might have also been giving illegal tattoos to Japanese citizens. Unfortunately, there's not much in the way of bridging the gap between the Meiji and the present day in anything I read. The short version is basically Japan continued to see tattoos as a criminal thing, but as Western influence has grown, the stigma is starting to wane, especially among those who opt for one-point tattoos, i.e. tattoos that don't cover the whole body. These were never much of a thing in Japan prior to globalization, and thus lack the criminal context. Irizumi still sketch people out and are, according to Pagan, especially unsavory on women because they're seen, as I've said, as both criminal and specifically very masculine. But tattoos are on the rise among Japanese women. QC one-points are common. They're seen as fashionable and safe to display almost anywhere. Women also get tattoos for deeper personal reasons. Pagan specifically mentions covering mastectomy scars. That's pretty cool stuff. Though, yeah, the broader tattoo industry in Japan suffers from being so disconnected from Japan's historical tattoo culture. It's a fashion industry driven mostly by Western trends. That's probably inevitable and impossible to curb given the history of irizumi, but it's sad. It's led some to believe that irizumi is on its way out, especially as your average Japanese tattoo convention is heavily biased towards Western-styled ink. But Horiyoshi III had a different perspective. He is notably one of many modern irizumi artists to use an electric needle to outline his tattoos and traditional tools for everything else. Perhaps this combination of modern and traditional methods informs his perspective that, quote, if there are tattoo artists using machines, there will always be people that want to do it by hand. He also said, the fact that American tattoos became so hot is just reflective of Japanese people going ecstatic over it. This is typically Japanese, to get overly excited over something and then get over it quickly too. We'll see how that one ages, but I think he's got a point about people doing it by hand. And his perspective on changing tattoo demographics is also important as an older artist. He says, nowadays I have 90% non-Yakuza clients and 10% Yakuza clients. 10 years ago it was much different. Things are changing for tattoos in Japan, mostly for the better. The art form has gone from illegal to associated with criminals to being so mainstream that the major issue became missing the soul and craftsmanship those early tattoos had. Innocent men and women can wear them freely now, albeit with some caveats. You probably won't be surprised to learn that the person who spent like 30% of their last video going on a rant about the Industrial Revolution doesn't fully jive with the direction things have headed. I think the work, history, and symbolism in the traditional irizumi is worth a lot more than a small fashion statement. But unlike automation and traditional craftsmanship, these two disciplines are both worthwhile ventures that can coexist in a healthy manner. A balance can be struck, and I think folks like Horiyoshi III have the right idea. I hope they're the future. One more thing for the road. Pagan's thesis ends on a lengthy delineation about depictions of tattooed women in media, which I think is worth taking a look at. It's a good introduction to the cultural attitudes toward a demographic that, in real life, has pretty much always been much smaller and less dangerous than Japanese fiction might have you believe. I don't want to spend too much time on it or cover everything she does because she's experienced more of this media than I have. Go read her original article or just seek out the stuff I talk about here if any of it catches your interest. What I'm offering is only the shallowest introduction to a broad and very worthwhile rabbit hole. This part is split into two sections, one about art by men and the other about art by women. Herein lies my only big gripe with her approach. All of the art by men is fiction, and almost everything by a woman is non-fiction. That makes some kind of sense. Japan is a male-dominated culture, and fiction is, in a lot of ways, a more concentrated dose of the culture it was produced in than non-fiction. This approach basically means you're first witnessing how tattooed women are represented in culture, then experiencing their lives in their own words. That's fine. But female Japanese writers, and especially those who write with a female audience in mind, are highly underrepresented in the West. This could have been a great opportunity to highlight some underrated movies, novels, or shoujo manga. We really need to be talking more about fiction by Japanese women. They make some good shit. Anyway, here's some fiction by Japanese men. The earliest story she discusses is the 1910 short story Shisei by... Whoa. I should have looked up how to pronounce that name. Taniski Junichiro. She spent some time explaining that most English translations have opted for the title The Tattooer, while the original Japanese is closer to The Tattoo. And this, she says, is suggestive of how Western audiences perceive women in work. I don't disagree. As small as the change is, it completely shifts the reader's focus from the woman protagonist to the male antagonist, while also centering that focus on his occupation rather than the art he created as a result of that occupation. It might seem trivial, but no, that's kind of fascinating. The story seems pretty neat too. I'm definitely going to check it out sometime. It's about an apprentice geisha who's retained her youthful innocence despite her history in the floating world. Her dual nature, and all the transitory emotions you get at that age, are the focal point of the story. She happens upon a sadistic tattoo artist who enjoys the pain he inflicts on those he tattoos, and knows she's the woman upon whom he'll tattoo his masterpiece. He drugs her and forces a tattoo of a black widow onto her back. This kills her innocent side, and she turns into a sort of femme fatale figure. The tattooer tells her, "Your old fears are gone, all men will be your victims." She replies, "All my old fears have been swept away, and you are my first victim." Obviously, the act of ending a girl's innocence by forcing a tattoo onto her is a metaphor for rape, and the femme fatale rape-revenge plot would prove very popular in depictions of tattooed women going forwards, especially in the mid to late 20th century. On that note, if you're easily upset by discussions of sexual violence, I'd recommend dropping off here. Me, personally, I understand that rape is a difficult subject to depict in fiction. I understand that using it as a plot device can turn out real bad. But no matter how bad the actual depiction of sexual violence itself might be, at the end of the day, I'm a simple person. I will always love watching, reading about, or listening to rapists getting their asses beat. And we got a lot of that coming up. See especially the pinky violence genre. This film genre came into prominence during the 60s and 70s when movie theaters in Japan were going downhill as more people bought TVs. To bring people back to the theaters, film companies started producing cheap, exploitative films full of sex, violence, and questionable depictions of people on the margins of society. Pinky violence films ranged greatly in terms of actual artistic merit. A lot of them were just sex and violence for its own sake, but like every edgy fringe art scene, some people came to the world of pinky violence with something more substantial to say. The pinky violence era of Japanese cinema is still influencing their fiction to this day, and there's one specific archetype Pagan highlights that I've definitely seen pop up in newer media. That's the sukeban, the girl gone bad. They're marginalized femme fatales, orphans or criminals of some sort, frequently survivors of rape, and always capable fighters. And as you've probably already inferred, these women are also commonly tattooed and out for revenge. One example is female demon Oyaku. The titular Oyaku is prosecuted after she and her boyfriend try to rob the treasury. He gets killed, she is beaten and raped, and then sent to an all-male prison. They're assuming, of course, that she'll experience even more humiliation and sexual violence there. Instead, it turns out the warden's wife is a lesbian tattoo artist. She gives our girl a Hania back tattoo, the Hania being the titular female demon. Hania masks were these creepy-looking demon masks worn in no theater to symbolize a woman overcome with jealousy and vengeful rage. They're a common sight in Japanese media, usually associated with women, of course, but the first place I saw one was as a back tattoo on a man. Goro Majima here has a Hania tattoo, though he's not usually portrayed as a particularly vengeful or jealous guy. I think in his case the tattoo is more representative of his unpredictable, violent, and kind of flamboyant and effeminate nature. Oyaku's definitely wearing her Hania for more traditional reasons. Once the tattoo is completed, she becomes an embodiment of the Hania. Her tenure in the joint comes to a premature end as she breaks out and goes on to kill every single motherfucker who ever hurt her. This movie sounds awesome. I gotta watch more Pinky movies. Speaking of, the thesis also gets into the movies Sex and Fury and Female Yakuza Tale, a duology of revenge stories centered on Inoshika Ocho. Her father was killed by 3 Yakuza, the deer, the boar, and the butterfly. She gets a tattoo of each animal as a constant reminder of her revenge mission. Pagan says that, on the whole, she's not as overtly sexualized as Oyaku, but if you can believe it, the movie series, titled Sex and Fury, still contains a lot of sex. She fights with her right breast hanging out, ostensibly to help with her movement, and typically loses clothes during combat. She also kills the deer by covering her body in poison before fucking him. Not to mention, Female Yakuza Tale is a rape revenge story where she takes down a whole Yakuza organization alongside a gang of fully nude women. I don't think I've made much of a secret of the fact that I think this shit rules. I love pulpy mid-century action movies, and I love stupid, violent, horny media. I grew up on edgy outsider comics like Love and Rockets, Black Hole, and Jim O'Barr's own rape revenge adjacent The Crow. So it's easy for me to look past all that sex and fury, since it's kind of my home turf. The Crow, for example, is a gory, edgy angst fest that has a lot to say about grief and the self-destructive way men treat themselves. I'm sure when I get around to watching more of these movies, I'll feel similarly about them. Like, the eye candy and shock value are more than apparent to me. I understand that these movies were made by and for men, and that they objectify women, and I get that these sorts of objectified depictions of marginalized people can do more to other them than empower them. But am I ever gonna fully look past a movie where a gang of women beat up a bunch of rapists? No, of course not. Even if the movies were made by men, even if the femme fatale archetype and the whole idea that women have to be strong or masculine to be empowered is completely wrong-headed, this feels closer to sexualization on the women's terms, at least on screen, if not behind the scenes. The act of rape is punished, the women have power, at least in the fiction. I don't know, there's something there. It somehow winds up feeling a lot less fetishized than some modern media. Alright, but let's round things off by actually giving those real tattooed women a voice. Because as I said, Pagan's thesis includes fiction by men and non-fiction by women. She focuses on a couple of documentaries and books by real Japanese women who got tattoos for various reasons, more positive reasons generally than the horny violence of the Pinky films, or indeed the courtesans of the Edo period. While there's still an obvious undertone of rebellion against traditional expectations of women, the reasons are generally more like coping with past trauma or just having a unique fashion statement. I don't want to spend too much of this video fully just ripping one source, and this video has been going on a long time already, so I'm just going to run through these a little faster. Shoko Tendo got an Irizumi of a legendary courtesan as a way to symbolize starting her life over with more confidence than she'd ever had before. She knew damn well how weird and risky it was to get a full back tat, as she was the daughter of a Yakuza, but she didn't really care. It helped her move on from the turbulent life her father had given her, while also allowing her to pay him some kind of respect. She talks about this and all kinds of other stuff in her book Yakuza Moon, Memoirs of a Gangster's Daughter, which is the 3rd or 4th book I want to read now because of this video. Speaking of dads, Naomi Kawase made 2 documentaries about her struggles with parental abandonment. Her mother left her, and she never knew her dad, and it turned out he was dead. He had a carp tattooed on his sleeves. She wanted a carp on her back, but the documentary includes a scene where a tattoo artist talks her out of it, saying it's probably a bad idea to get a tattoo out of resentment or grief. So she gets a back tattoo anyway, but not of a carp. So, it's also symbolic of new beginnings and letting go of parental trauma. And there is actually one piece of fiction by a woman in here, the novella Snakes and Earrings. It's about a girl named Louis who falls for a young punk and wants to emulate his forked tongue and back tat. She meets a tattoo artist with a Kirin on his arm and asks for a Kirin back tattoo. He refuses because the artist who gave him his Kirin died and he's superstitious about it. She says she'll just not complete the tattoo, leaving the eyes empty. He agrees, and she pays him for the tattoo through sex, beginning an abusive relationship. Eventually, she fills in the eyes of the tattoo, which is symbolic of her taking control of her life. I think it's important to note how many women depict tattoos as symbolic of a new beginning, and how often that's tied to getting over a man who'd left her with some kind of emotional baggage. That's present in some of the male-authored works as well, but there's a stark contrast present. In the works by men, women get tattoos out of anger as one of the first steps down a dark and violent road. They're visual confirmation of the lust for revenge inflicted by an attempted rape or murder. In the works by women, the completion of a tattoo is the last step off of that road. They both come from places of social othering and some kind of trauma, of course. Ink is still heavily associated with crime in Japan, after all. But it's cool that the actual philosophy behind getting it is so much more nuanced and positive than the fiction tends to be. And that's about all I got for you today. Thanks for sticking with me through such a weird and annoyingly long and rambly video. Even if by the end it warped into me ranting about somebody's decade-old college thesis, I'm proud of how this one turned out. And I also have to go add like 4 books to my TBR. See you soon, hopefully. Thanks for watching.